again, and welcome to part 2 of Is She a Prophet? We're examining the early works of Ellen White today, or her early childhood to her first vision. I wish I could put so much information out there for you right now, but it would take too long for this video and too long in the series. So I'm just going to hit the high points, and then we're going to spend some time on this first vision, because this first vision is where things get good. Ellen White was born in 1827. This is a part of history that we call the Second Great Awakening in U.S. history and in religion. This is where many of the churches were pushing for revival, and because of this, revival, reformation, and because of this, Bible prophecy became a very big part of the conversations of the day. So Ellen grew up in a very prophetically prophecy-charged environment in the religious side. Especially in the northern United States, you had people like Joseph Smith, who was getting visions and established the Latter-day Saints, the Church of Latter-day Saints. You also had people like William Miller, who were starting up this movement that ended up being called the Millerite movement, that attested that Jesus was coming in 1844. I'm not getting into the details of how he did that, but basically what it boils down to is he was studying he's a farmer, he's studying the books of Daniel and Revelation, comparing them to one another, comes up with this wild equation that, hey, in 1843, Jesus is coming back, we need to get ready, and this starts a big movement. Also in that time, you had these people called the Shakers. These were a more extreme group within the Quakers. And these Shakers specifically had visions, lots of visions. In fact, their young girls were the ones that would have the most visions, and they would have visions of heaven, and when they would come out of their visions, they would paint these very elaborate portraits and pictures of what they had seen. So Ellen White grew up in this time when this prophecy, visions, prophets, this was not an uncommon thing. This impacts her in more ways than I think she probably thought that it impacted her. One of the people that she loved to see speak was William Foy. He was a black minister in Maine, and he had a number of visions also about prophecy and heaven, and he was one of the Millerites as well. He bought into this movement that Jesus is coming in 1843. Obviously, Jesus didn't come because we're all still here, but the gist of it is they set multiple days for Jesus to come, and Jesus didn't come on any of them. The biggest disappointment is called the Great Disappointment, and this occurred in October 22nd of 1844. This is the day that several of the biblical scholars in this movement had decided that Jesus was going to come back. To this end, several people sold all their possessions, getting ready for this, and Jesus didn't show up. And so because of that, the movement of these people had left their normal churches and joined this movement. These people had nowhere to go. Several of them left and went back to their old lives and their old churches, but the ones that were left didn't know what to do. So what happened was, the next day, this man by the name of Hiram Edson is walking to, he's also a Millerite, he's walking to visit some of his other believers, and he's walking through a cornfield with one of his friends, and he has what he considers a vision. And Adventists call this the vision in the cornfield. And what this is this vision of the Old Testament tabernacle from Exodus, and Jesus is in the high priest garbs, and he leaves the holy place and enters the most holy place. And what was deducted from that was something very interesting. This is called the closed door theory. Adventists today say that this started this thing they call the investigative judgment. I'm not going to get into that, but it's extremely unbiblical. But this closed door theory is even more unbiblical than that, if you could believe it. What this basically meant was that in 1844, October 22nd, 1844, Jesus stopped being our mediator and went into the most holy place to become our judge. And so what this meant was that after October 22nd, 1844, nobody could be saved. And the only people that were saved, the only remnant, was the people that believed in William Miller's teachings. So that's a very interesting thing that is not really talked about. A lot of people, even in the church themselves, don't know this even happened. So this is very interesting. We're going to get into it here in a minute. This vision happens. No one knows to confirm it or not until Ellen White has her first vision. And in her first vision, it's called the Vision of Heaven. It happens in December, so barely, maybe 2 months after the Great Disappointment and after Hiram Edson has this. And this vision, as well as a couple others, seem to confirm what Hiram Edson said. Okay, so his vision, this confirms that what he saw was the right thing. When she shares this vision, ironically enough, William Foy, the person that she'd seen several times during the Millerite movement, she'd gone to visit him in his speeches in Portland and in Cape Elizabeth. He sits down and listens to her visions, and at the end of the day, he jumps up and exclaims, "That's exactly what I saw." Oddly enough, I don't know how the meeting ended, but he leaves that wherever Ellen is talking, he never sees her again. He never talks to her again, never does anything. Now, the Adventists and Ellen White will tell you that this was the time that she was confirmed. Basically, this is one prophet endorsed another prophet, so boom, she is a prophet. I don't think William Foy believed that. The reason why is he never follows up with her again. There is no further contact. In fact, the next year, he starts to copyright all of his work. So maybe she saw that, maybe she imagined it, or maybe it was his vision. Very interesting. I'm not going to get into too much details about that, but it's very interesting. I do know that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there's a pastor by the name of J.N. Lawbro. He was one of the early Adventists. He did this little historical piece on William Foy, and basically the way he tried to explain it to everyone, for everyone to accept it, was that when William Foy met in that hall meeting and he endorsed Ellen White, that was a metaphorical passing the prophecy baton to her, and that he later died a couple years later out of sickness. That is until you look at history and you find out that he lived until 1893, and he pastored several Free Will Baptist churches during that time. So he was definitely alive during the time, definitely knew of Ellen White, but definitely for some very interesting reasons, never approached her again. And for the looks of it, he looks like he just kept his distance from her. So let's talk about her first vision now. This is where we're going to spend most of our time. Her first vision, I'm going to put a picture up behind me. This is her first vision right here. And basically it shows the Millerite people walking in this thin line, leaving the world and going to heaven. And along this process, you'll see people falling off the path. They stop believing, they go away. And so much so that this is her first vision. Enough people fall off. There's like this thinning of the herd, if you will. But finally, the select few make it to heaven, and then the vision goes into describing what is in heaven and all the beauty that is found there. This vision gets published in this little book called The Call to the Little Flock, I believe is what it is called. A Word to the Little Flock is the correct title for that, and it is published in 1847. From then, it's revised once in early 1850 and then never again. And her words kind of go away. That vision goes away. It does confirm that Hiram Edson was onto something, but that's about it. And 7 years later, though, before we get into this vision discussing it, this closed door theology or theory or whatever you want to call it is recanted by Ellen and James White, but they never publicly recant it. They let it die, if you will. They just don't talk about it anymore, and they move on. So basically, the whole gist of this, what happens is this Word to Little Flock is an 11 edition or 11 pamphlets that are mailed out to these believers, and in these pamphlets she talks about her vision. And these papers in the 1850s, they go away. They just stop making them. They come out with this new thing, the Adventist Review, or that's what it's called nowadays, the Advent Review, published by the Review and Herald Publishing House, which is founded by James White, which is her husband. So if we fast forward, in the 1880s, after a lot of clamor from the Adventist church body for Ellen White's original visions, her early ministry, her early work, that stuff that happened before the church was established. Everyone wants that because she's a prophet and they want to see all of her revelations. So they the General Conference, G.I. Butler is the conference president. He authorizes, he works with Ellen White, and they together, Ellen White oversees the whole project, and they release this book called Early Writings. And this is supposed to be a very accurate, very concise collection of all of her visions before the church was established. That's fair. In the book, he actually goes as far as saying in the foreword, and before I get into that, I'm going to be reading out of the book, Life of Ellen White. This is written by Dudley M. Canright. This gentleman was around the Whites during the church formation. He was fundamental to church formation, and later on he was thrown out because he could not authoritatively say, after investigating everything, that Ellen White was inspired of God. He just couldn't. But before he gets into that position, here's a dialogue that he has, or that he records, that happened when Early Writings was released in 1882. In the preface, the publishers say a widespread interest has arisen in all of her works, especially in the early years, and the call for the publication has become imperative. No portion of the work has been omitted. No single change has been made in any idea or sentiment of the original work, and the verbal changes have been made under the author's own eye and with her full approval. So nothing's been changed, but if anything has been changed, Ellen White has looked over it and approved on it. Okay? That's what we need to focus on. So many have greatly desired to have in possession all she has written, and they just go on. I'm not going to go into those details. Immediately after Early Writings gets published in 1882, Elder A.C. Long prints a counter-publication, and it's an article, a 16-page article. And what he does is that he titles it Comparison of Early Writings of Mrs. White with Later Publications. And what he does is he compares all these early publications, which have somehow disappeared from the church, very mysteriously, I might add, with the current book, Early Writings. He puts them side by side and points out glaring differences. So, I want to read to you from her first vision. This is Early Writings, page 33, talking about these people walking and the ones that doubt. Others rashly denied the light behind them and said that it was not God that had led them out so far, referring to the Millerites that have been disappointed. The light behind them went out, leaving their feet in perfect darkness, and they stumbled and lost sight of the mark of Jesus, or of the mark and of Jesus, and fell off the path down into the dark and wicked world below. Period. The next sentence, soon we heard the voice of God like many waters, which gave us the day and hour of Jesus' coming. Here's where the big issue is with this vision. Again, we're not supposed to be doctoring anything that's been divinely inspired, right? Well, when Elder A.C. Long puts out his stuff, he compares this because he still has copies of this original, and he shows this out really very interesting. We read down 33 lines of this publication and discover that the late republished work agrees with the old on nearly word for word, with only a few slight changes without altering the sense. But at the end of the 33rd line, we find 4 lines that have been omitted or suppressed. These read as follows. It was just as impossible for them, those who gave up their faith in the 1844 movement, to get on the path again and go to the city, or heaven, as all of the wicked world which God had rejected. They fell all along the path, one after another. So now that you heard the first version of Early Writings, let's read it with this information put into it. The light behind them went out, leaving their feet in perfect darkness, and they stumbled and lost sight of the mark of Jesus, and fell off the path down to the dark and wicked world below. It was just as impossible for them to get back on the path again and go to the city as all the wicked world that God had rejected. They fell all along the path, one after another. Why was this removed? It's very simple. This teaches the shut door theology of on October 22nd, God shuts the door and nobody else can get into heaven. This had been moved away from the church for 30 plus years. The Whites officially moved away from this stance, or at least let the stance die out in 1851. This is now 1882. So 31 years ago is when they joined reality and realized that wasn't the case. But rather than recant that, they just kind of let it die and tucked it away. Very interesting. There's also another vision that happens in 1851, June 29th, that Ellen White writes about in this Word to Little Flock and in another magazine called another article called The Present Truth. And this one there's a vision that's not even in the book Early Writings. And if we read the quote of this, it says, "Then I saw that Jesus prayed for his enemies, but that should not cause us or lead us to pray for the wicked world whom God had rejected. When he prayed for his enemies, there was hope for them, and they could be benefited and saved by his prayers. And also after he was a mediator in the outer apartment for the whole world. But now his spirit and sympathy were withdrawn from the world, and our sympathy must be with Jesus and must be withdrawn from the ungodly." Why aren't these visions in the book Early Writings? It's a very simple answer. This teaches the shut door doctrine in the very plainest terms possible. When we get into the investigation of this, what we will find is that the editor in charge of this in 1881 was Uriah Smith. He's been the editor about this time, or he was the editor of the Review and Herald for over 50 years. So when this elder puts out this counter to Early Writings, Uriah Smith is furious and he wants to prove that this is incorrect. So he goes back to try to find these documents, and guess what? Mysteriously, they don't exist anymore. The Review and Herald has no copies of them. So what happens? Well, we can't refute this. So Uriah Smith fires back and says, "Hey, we didn't keep all the copies. I can't say one way or another about this." Him and G.I. Butler, the conference president, get together. They say, "We can't find this." And so what happened? Well, we don't know. There's a theory that James White got rid of it and just stopped printing about it. He was the editor, or the person that was in charge of printing the early documents of the church. And so what we know is that what we have in Early Writings and what we have in A Little Word to the Flock are two very different things and teach very different things. Under this first vision that is unadulterated, nobody can come back to Jesus. And this is a stance that is obviously moved away from 10 years later, or 7 years later. The interesting part comes when D.M. Canwright, the writer of this book, the friend of Ellen White, writes to Elder F.M. Wilcox in 1915, a few years after Early Writings comes out, urging him to republish the old works unadulterated, offering to loan him copies. Canwright had copies of the originals. Of all those documents from 1847, he had them. He messages the conference president twice and gets nothing back in response. It's very obvious the church wants to move past this and doesn't want to deal with this. So either Ellen White is a prophet, legitimately, or she's not. But now the church has an argument that they have to face, and the way they face it is to just not have an argument. We're just not even going to have the discussion. So guys, I thank you for sitting with me through this. There's a lot more I really wanted to get into, but I'm not going to be really able to get into it with this video. Basically, what causes the shut door theology to go away is literally, what about the babies? Millerites were having babies all the time. They were trying to they wanted to get married. They wanted to move on with their lives as believers. And you can't have babies saved if the door of salvation has already been closed. So that's when the closed door theology becomes more of the investigative judgment theology that you see now in SDA churches, and becomes more of a, what I call, or what several people call, the swinging door, where we peek it a little bit open, okay, kids can get in, and then later it's, okay, only really, really earnest Christians can get in, and okay, well now everyone can get in if they are saved. So it's a very interesting soup of how this door that gets shut apparently comes back open. I thank you for watching this video. Let me know if you have questions or comments on this. I'll try to answer them. This is where the stuff gets good, and I wish we had more time to go over this, but that is the time we have allotted. Our next video is going to be the early years of Ellen White going into early church formation. So thank you guys for watching, and have a great day.